on page 5-3 of the entry checklist.
Houston Discovery, thanks for those words, CJ. It was a great mission. We enjoyed it. We enjoyed working with you and all the teams at Mission Control. We're glad that the International Space Station is stocked up again. Thanks a lot.